I'm going to speak. I've been asked to speak for about half an hour, and then we can have a general discussion either about what I have said or about anything else about the EU. I may not know the answer, but I'm happy to discuss it with you and reflect jointly on EU issues. But what I'm going to talk about over the next half hour is a little bit about how EU environment policy has developed, where we are at the moment, and particularly what I see as some of the challenges that we're facing in trying to promote greater sustainability over the future. First, I'm sure you do all know, but I would just recall what the EU is. The EU is a union of 27 different countries. We have come together jointly to pool our policy development, decision making, to have common rules in certain areas. But of course the countries are very different, and this means that any policy that's developed at the EU level has to take into account the diversity of conditions, physical conditions on the ground that obviously affect the environment, but also institutional conditions, political conditions. And any policy, any steps that we take at the union level ultimately, therefore, are a kind of compromise that take into account the very different needs and desires of the different countries. Environment has been an area where the countries have worked together since 1972, but it was not the original areas, it was not among the original areas where the countries of Europe came together. Europe was constructed originally in the aftermath of the Second World War. It was constructed very definitely as a political project, a project to hopefully ensure, or at least make it more likely, that we wouldn't have another war on the continent, that we wouldn't see a repetition of the devastation from the First World War and the Second World War, that we would instead come together and pool our destinies, not only to avoid war, but also with the recognition that by coming together, we could address common problems, that we could be much more than the individual countries were. So from the beginning in the 1950s, one of the main areas of collaboration for the EU was economic policy. We originally linked together the coal and steel communities, but increasingly brought in other areas of economic activity, so that instead of each country working as a separate market, there was one common market where the different barriers to the free movement of people, the free movement of goods, free movement of services, free movement of capital, that they were progressively broken down. And this was and is an economic project, but always with this bigger political purpose of trying to ensure peace and prosperity on the continent. Now, as the years went by and the economic union was being developed, we came into the 70s. The 70s, at a global scale, there was an increasing interest in environmental issues. We saw, in fact, at that time that the US had moved ahead, and it may seem a little ironic now, but one of the big inspirations for EU environment policy was, in fact, the steps that the US had taken on the development, particularly of the Clean Air Act. So the EU was interested in also moving ahead with environment policy, but at that time, environment was not mentioned in the treaties. It was not an area where the 27, well at that time it was fewer, but the countries of the EU had agreed to share their policy and their legislation. So in fact, when there was this global interest developing in environment, the discussion in the EU actually was focused a little bit more on the relationship between environment and the development of the single market. And the original reason, the original legal reason that environment policy was introduced in the EU was actually to facilitate the single market. Because having different types of environment policy in different countries, different levels of standards, was a barrier to the single market. If companies were working in different countries, they had to meet different levels of environment regulation. That was a barrier whereby the countries that had the stricter rules were more expensive and more difficult for their companies to compete as opposed to the other ones. So one of the main drivers actually behind the development of environment policy was German industry. They didn't necessarily want the EU norms to go beyond the German norms, but they sure wanted the other countries in the EU to bring their norms up to something more similar to what they had to face in Germany. So 1972, we saw the development of the first Environment Action Program. Now, at that time, we set out the program on the legal base of the single market, but we put rather broad ambitions for moving towards an ecological equilibrium, dealing with resource issues. In practice, though, what did we do? Well, it was very much, early legislation was very much focused on establishing emissions norms, particularly into the air, but also into the water, into the soil. Legislation that set specific standards, for instance, for the level of contaminants that could be in drinking water. Specific standards on the amount of different pollutants that factories could emit into the air. And that fit very well into the logic of the single market, that the economic producers had to have the same rules, same emission standards across all of the European community. But of course, that really wasn't going to be addressing the bigger issues, and we saw that more needed to be done. By, I think it was, and I should know the date, I want to say 79, maybe that's not right. I'd have to look up. There was a legal base brought in for environment. Doesn't matter. It came in, say, 10 years later. And at that point, then, of course, we were able to take a broader approach to the development of environment policy. But we moved gradually. We moved from these single pieces of legislation addressing specific contaminants towards, first of all, an integrated approach to emission controls. So factories, producers needed to look at the overall impact that their activity was having on the environment, rather than just following regulations for each different kind of contaminant they were producing. But we moved on even further from that to an approach that we would call more strategic. We started to look more at what are the drivers of economic activities that are having an impact on the environment. What are the factors in other policy sectors that are having an influence on how we manage our environment, how we use our resources? So by about around 2000 or so, we saw an entire shift away from these single pieces of legislation towards the development of what we call framework legislation. And to give you an example, the Water Framework Directive, which was adopted in 2000, took an entirely different approach. Instead of having, as I say, standards for drinking water, standards for bathing water, standards for effluent from a wastewater treatment plant, the Water Framework Directive set a goal that all water bodies in the EU, including groundwater, should be managed to acquire a good status, which was further defined in the directive, by the year 2015. And the primary requirement of this directive was that the governments, because it's the national governments that need to implement the EU environment legislation, needed to put into place mechanisms to develop river basin management plans. And they needed to do this bringing on board all of the different stakeholders for each river basin. So this was a very innovative approach. It was a very different approach because we were saying each river basin is different, so how it needs to be managed is slightly different. But we can only do this by looking at all the different factors, all of the different actors who are influencing the river basin. And not only do we have to involve them, but we actually have to bring them on board in defining the specific management plan for each river basin. So very different approach. Sort of similarly, we've seen a shift in the area of waste. We saw the original legislation in the area of waste addressed things like the standards to which a landfill needed to be built, the way that incinerators worked, and particularly what kind of emissions they could have from their smokestacks, treatment of specific streams of waste, so how you're supposed to treat waste oils, how you're supposed to treat batteries, how you're supposed to treat end-of-life vehicles. Instead, the Waste Framework Directive took a different approach in 2008 and set out a waste hierarchy. It started by saying that waste should be considered a resource, that it was much better to not produce waste in the first place. If you had to produce waste, well, you should try to reuse whatever this thing that you consider waste to be. Somebody else should reuse it. If you can't reuse it, can you somehow dismantle it and reuse some of the components? If not, can you recover at least the energy from this product? So incineration with recuperation of the energy. Only if you can't do all of those should you send the material to landfill for disposal. So this was introducing an overarching philosophy, an overarching approach, which then should be brought to life in specific waste management activities in the individual countries. Of course, we still do have specific pieces of waste legislation. We have specific standards, for instance, for packaging waste, that all the countries in the EU must organize their own programs, but so as that they recycle a certain amount of packaging waste. We have legislation on addressing waste from electrical and electronic equipment. This is a very important waste stream because a lot of these little gadgets that we have contain not only the energy that has been incorporated in building them, but also materials, rare earth minerals that we don't have in the EU. So it's kind of silly to throw them into landfills. You're contaminating landfills with lots of nasty chemicals, but also you're throwing away this resource that's hard to get. So we have, as I say, we have this overarching framework, but we still maintain standards in certain areas. So for instance, a target on the recycling of electronic and electrical waste. So our environment policy has come a long way. We've seen a dramatic shift from the early legislation that was really just focused on individual contaminants up to a much more holistic strategic approach, looking at the factors that drive environmental degradation and trying to develop management approaches that are also a little more adapted to the local conditions. We have a huge volume of environment legislation. We now have over 300 different environment directives or regulations that need to be applied. And I should sort of say as an aside, that sounds like an awful lot. And in the US, probably you'd hear industry kicking up their heels and saying, how is this possible? Well, industry doesn't necessarily like stringent standards in the EU, but they continue to support the idea of having regulation at the EU level. So that original drive, that original interest of industry to have coherent standards still remains. And in general, in the EU, regulation is more accepted than in the US. I'd like to talk now just a little bit about where I see we've done well and where I see we've done less well. I think as one of the examples of where we've done well, I'd like to cite what we've done on climate change. Now, in fact, we've done so well on climate change. It's considered such an important problem that actually it's not dealt with by my Directorate General anymore. We have a new dedicated Directorate General that deals with climate change, but we still talk with them, so I still have some idea what they're doing. The Directors General don't talk so much, but we talk. So in the area of climate change, which by the way is an area which public opinion considers very important in Europe. We don't have the same debates about whether or not it's something that we need to address. It's the vast majority of people see it as an important issue. And in fact, there was a survey done last summer which said that 20% of the respondents actually considered climate change to be the most important problem that the global community needed to address. So there's a lot of public demand to do something about climate change, and as a result of this, the EU has been able to adopt a policy response. We've developed a number of legally binding targets for the year 2020. These are targets to reduce our emissions of greenhouse gases by 20% based on 1990 emissions levels, to increase the portion of our overall energy supply that comes from renewable sources to 20%, and to reduce the overall use of energy, so to increase our energy efficiency by 20%. In addition, we have targets, for instance, on the portion of the overall transport energy which should come from renewable sources. So we have quite clear targets. We also were able to set up an emissions trading scheme. This is a legally binding scheme. There was a lot of wrangling in the Council about exactly how the overall target should be divided up between the different countries. But the targets were established. It is widely supported, and it's more than anything, it's a mechanism that people can understand. Climate change may sound like a huge complicated problem, but actually it can be boiled down to something fairly simple. It's emissions of CO2 or CO2 equivalents into the atmosphere. We know the main sources of the CO2. They can be identified. And because we know who's producing this kind of contamination, we know how to measure more or less what's being produced, we can set up this emissions trading scheme whereby this should be the most economically efficient way to address it, business like that, by ensuring that the rights to pollute are acquired by those emitters who have the greatest difficulty or greatest cost in making the reductions. We've had a few hiccups. It's not all smooth sailing. The number of permits out on the market at the moment is more than it should be. We need to reduce the number of permits. But all in all, the process of the CO2 emissions trading is working. I would attribute this to the fact that it is what I would consider a relatively simple problem. We know what it is, we can articulate it, we can measure it, we've got a simple mechanism for trying to address it. In the context of dealing with climate change, the one area that we're not making such good progress is on the energy efficiency side. Our target, as I said, for the year 2020 is to reduce the overall use of energy by 20%. As we are going at the moment, if we continue on the same trend, we will only have a reduction of about 10%. So that's obviously not a successful trend. The Commission has put out some new proposals. They came out last autumn about how the legislation or voluntary systems should be changed to put us on the right track. In particular, the Commission would propose to set some kind of standards and targets for energy producers. This is now being discussed in the Council and the Parliament. As you may know, the Commission only makes proposals for legislation. It's the Council and the Parliament that actually make decisions. The Council represents the countries. The Parliament is the directly elected representatives of the citizens. There's a lot of discussion about how we should move ahead, whether the Commission's proposal makes sense, whether we should focus on the energy producers, whether instead perhaps there should be targets per country, and if so, how should those targets be set? Should they be related to GDP? But I would say the reason we're having a harder time at this is, sure, the energy producers have a role in energy efficiency or promoting it, but we all use energy. It's not as easy as targeting emissions of CO2. Yes, we do all emit CO2 in cars or in other means of transport, but we use energy in absolutely everything that we're doing. So it's much harder to see what regulatory approach to use to change the behavior of all of the citizens of Europe. Obviously, we can't say that every individual is going to go around with some energy meter and make sure that every individual reduces their energy use by 20%. I mean, that's obviously absurd. So,
why?
Well, because it would be very hard to measure, very hard to measure. Even in Europe, that would probably be seen as an infringement on individual rights. Even in Europe, no. So I mean, it's a much tougher problem. It's more complex. You've got more actors involved. It's harder to measure. It's harder to see what a simple solution would be. Moving away from climate change, looking at another area where I think we're not making such good progress, that would be in protection of biodiversity. Biodiversity, or more precisely nature, was introduced into the second Environmental Action Programme, so it's been an issue for the EU since the late 70s, but we're not making great progress. There are two important directives in the area of nature conservation, the Birds and the Habitats Directive. Between them, there are requirements to set up protected areas, and I put that in quotes because they are not areas where no human activity is allowed. Rather, they're areas that must be managed for maintaining the good status of certain species and habitats. Now, on paper, it looks like we've made good progress because 18% of the EU territory is now covered by these